It seems like everywhere you turn these days, the talk is all about the potential for another round of what some folks are calling the Trump tariff wars.
Yeah.
And it really makes you think, what's this all going to mean for us, like for the economy?
Yeah, you're right.
So we're going to try to cut through all that political noise, all the back and forth, and get down to the brass tacks, the economic nitty-gritty.
Yeah, let's do it.
And our goal today is to really understand how tariffs work, like who really foots the bill. And what does history tell us about what's likely to happen when we start messing around with trade policies like this? You've been sending me some really interesting stuff, past articles and reports that really break down the mechanics of these tariffs. And we're going to dig into some specific examples too, like what happened when Trump slapped those tariffs on China a few years back, and even the steel and aluminum tariffs. That should help us get a better handle on what the future might have in store. And we want you to walk away from this feeling like you really get it. You understand the potential economic fallout, but without getting lost in the weeds.
I think that's definitely achievable. It's easy to look at tariffs as, this sort of blunt instrument. Like you either use them to punish other countries or you use them to sort of, jumpstart industries here at home.
Right.
But like your research shows, the reality is a lot more complicated, a lot more nuanced, and the impacts, well, they can really boomerang back on us here in the U.S. in some pretty unexpected ways. And I think one of the things that's really fascinating is this whole misconception about who really ends up paying the price when tariffs get imposed.
Yeah, okay, so let's get that straight right off the bat, because this seems to be a point of confusion for a lot of people. There's this common belief that when the U.S. puts a tariff on, say, electronics coming in from China, it's the Chinese companies that are on the hook for that extra cost, right? But that's not actually how it works, is it?
Not exactly, no. The real story, and your sources highlight this over and over again, is that it's the American businesses.
Really?
The companies here in the U.S. that are bringing those goods into the country, they're the ones who actually have to pay the tariff. And they pay it right when those products hit our shores.
So right at customs.
Right at customs. So, that catchy phrase, China pays the tariffs, it's kind of misleading. It's oversimplifying things and kind of obscuring the real immediate costs that our businesses have to shoulder. Let's take that 25% tariff on Chinese electronics as an example. When an American company imports those goods, they've got to fork over that extra 25% right then and there to U.S. Customs. It's a direct hit to their bottom line.
Okay, so let's walk through this then. Now, these American businesses, they're faced with some tough choices, right? I mean, they could just eat that extra cost, take the hit to their profits.
Yeah.
They could try to pass it along to us, the consumers, by raising their prices.
Right.
Or they could start looking around for different suppliers, maybe in countries that aren't subject to these tariffs.
Exactly. And that brings us to a really sharp observation you made earlier about the possibility that some businesses might actually, choose to keep their profits nice and high instead of actually bringing those manufacturing jobs back to the U.S., even with the tariffs in place.
Yeah.
The main financial incentive for them might not be to, reshore those jobs.
Which makes sense, I guess.
Yeah.
If they can still find a way to get that product cheaper overseas, even with the tariff added on.
Right.
They could just bump up the price a bit for us here and still come out ahead. Maybe even more so than if they went through the whole rigmarole of setting up factories in the U.S. with, higher labor costs and everything.
You hit the nail on the head. And what's even more interesting to think about is how these tariffs can kind of create this whole pricing atmosphere. Companies might start feeling like, hey, we can raise prices not just on those things that are directly hit by the tariff, but also on similar stuff that isn't even targeted.
Oh, so it's like using the tariffs as an excuse.
Exactly. Tariff pressure becomes the justification.
So it's not just the specific things of the actual products that got hit with the tariff that get more expensive. It can actually ripple out and cause prices to rise across the board. It's like a mini inflation bomb.
You got it. That's a really key point. And here's another thing that your research points out, and it's kind of surprising. Instead of seeing companies moving production back to the U.S. in response to tariffs, they often just shuffle their supply chains around.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they end up moving operations to other countries that have lower costs, places that aren't facing the same tariffs, places like Vietnam, Mexico, Taiwan. So instead of a big boost for American manufacturing, it's more like a global game of musical chairs, shifting production around to wherever it's cheapest.
Okay. Now, we have seen a few cases where tariffs did seem to lead to some job growth, right? Like in the steel and aluminum industries. But it sounds like those are more like the exception, not the rule.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction. You're right. There can be this, this initial bump in employment, right, in those specific industries that are being protected by the tariffs.
Right.
But when you look at the bigger picture, the overall impact on U.S. jobs, it's usually pretty small. And in some cases, it can even be negative.
Now, why is that? I mean, if a tariff makes imported steel more expensive, shouldn't that naturally lead to higher demand for American-made steel, which would then mean more jobs in those steel mills? Seems like a pretty straightforward equation.
You'd think so, right? I mean, that's kind of the whole point of the tariff in the first place. But there are these other forces at play that often work against that happening.
Okay.
First of all, you have to remember that labor costs here in the U.S., they tend to be higher than in a lot of other countries that are churning out these manufactured goods.
Right.
And if you really want to ramp up production here, I mean, really scale it up.
Yeah.
We'd need to rebuild a lot of our industrial infrastructure. We'd have to overhaul supply chains. That takes a ton of time, a ton of investment, a ton of resources.
Makes sense.
And as we talked about earlier, businesses have this whole global buffet of sourcing options. So even if we put tariffs on one country, they can just pivot, find their supplies somewhere else. That really undercuts the whole idea of boosting domestic industries through tariffs.
So let's get real here for a minute and dig into some actual examples of how this is all played out.
Yeah.
Those tariffs that the Trump administration put on goods coming from China between 2018 and 2020, those were some pretty big moves, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're talking about tariffs on over $300 billion worth of imports from China.
Wow.
And those tariff rates, they went up to 25%.
That's a huge chunk of change.
And of course, China didn't just sit back and take it. They fired back with their own retaliatory tariffs on a bunch of stuff that we were exporting. It was this whole back and forth tit for tat.
Yeah, it was a real trade war.
Yeah.
So the goals, at least the stated goals, were pretty clear, right? Bring back those American manufacturing jobs, make us less reliant on China, and shrink that trade deficit we've got. But when you look back, how did it actually pan out? Do we hit those targets?
Well, as those articles and reports you shared indicate, the results on the ground didn't really match up with the aspirations. Those tariffs, they ended up hitting American importers the hardest. And guess what? That led to price hikes on all sorts of everyday stuff that people buy: washing machines, electronics, tools, all kinds of things. The goal was to fire up job growth here in the U.S., but a bunch of studies suggest that it actually backfired. Yeah, they actually estimate a net job loss. And get this, the Federal Reserve, they put the number of jobs lost because of these tariffs at around 300,000.
300,000 jobs? That's massive.
It is. And despite slapping those tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods, the trade imbalance basically stayed the same. It just shows how incredibly complex these global supply chains really are.
So instead of companies packing up and moving production back to the U.S., they basically just found other countries to do business with.
Exactly. We saw this shift happening, companies moving their operations to countries like Vietnam, Taiwan, Mexico, but there wasn't this huge wave of manufacturing coming back to the U.S. because of those tariffs.
Interesting. And what about those tariffs on steel and aluminum imports back in 2018? The idea there, as I recall, was to breathe some life back into American metal production, which had been struggling for years.
Right. And in that specific case, we did see some good things happen, at least within those industries.
Yeah.
U.S. steel production, it did go up a bit, and some of those old plants, they either reopened or they were able to make more steel than before. So you could argue that in that very narrow sense, it was a win.
Right.
But as always, you can't just look at one little piece of the puzzle. You got to zoom out and see the whole picture, see all the ripple effects.
Right, because there are always trade-offs.
Always trade-offs. And those tariffs, they ended up making things a lot tougher for American companies that need steel and aluminum to make their products. Think about car manufacturers, appliance makers, all those industries. Their raw materials just got pricier. So they're squeezed. They have to find ways to cut costs somewhere, and sometimes that means laying people off. And in the end, they might have to raise prices on those cars, those appliances, and that can hurt demand. It's like this chain reaction.
It's all connected.
It is. And the Peterson Institute actually did some number crunching and estimated that for every steel job that was saved by those tariffs, it costs the economy something like $900,000 in losses elsewhere. That's a pretty hefty price tag. It really makes you think, were those limited benefits really worth it?
That's a great point. It seems like we always come back to this fundamental question: who's really paying the price? We've touched on it, but let's make sure it's crystal clear, for those listening who are still scratching their heads.
Sure.
When the U.S. hits imported goods with a tariff, let's say, for example, electronics from China, worth, oh, I don't know, $100,000.
Okay.
And there's a 25% tariff on those electronics. Who's writing the check for that $25,000? Who's actually shelling out the cash?
It's the American company, the importer, the one that placed the order and is bringing those goods into the country. They're the ones cutting that $25,000 check to U.S. Customs. China, or whichever foreign country we're talking about, they don't pay that tariff directly.
Interesting. But then why do so many people have this idea that the exporting country, China in this case, is the one taking the hit?
Well, I think a lot of that has to do with how it's talked about in the news and by politicians.
Okay.
You know, tariffs are often framed as this way to punish other countries for what we see as unfair trade practices or to make their products less appealing to American buyers.
Right.
And yeah, the idea is that those tariffs will make those foreign goods more expensive here in the U.S.
Right.
But the immediate financial burden, the one who has to pay up front, that's American businesses.
Yeah.
So when you hear someone say, China pays the tariffs, take it with a grain of salt, it's not telling the whole story.
So those American businesses are basically stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? I mean, they're like, to figure out how to deal with these added costs. They could try raising prices for us, the consumers, hope we don't balk, or they could take a hit to their profits. They could try to find new suppliers in countries that aren't being hit with tariffs, or maybe they could even try to, work the system, lobby the government for some kind of exemption.
You got it. Those are pretty much the options they're left with. And now, this is something you brought up earlier that I thought was really insightful. What happens if China keeps sending us stuff, even if no American companies have placed orders for it?
Yeah, that was something I was kind of puzzling over. If there's no American buyer waiting in the wings, would China still get stuck with the tariff when those goods arrive on our shores?
That's a perfectly logical question, but here's the thing about international trade. Imports are pretty much always based on orders that have already been placed by American buyers.
Okay.
Chinese companies aren't typically just shipping massive amounts of stuff across the ocean on a wing in a prayer, hoping they'll find someone to buy it when it gets here.
Right.
That's a recipe for financial disaster.
Yeah, it'd be incredibly risky.
Incredibly risky and expensive. So when you see those containers coming into our ports, you can bet there's an American buyer on the other end who's already signed on the dotted line and is legally responsible for those import duties, the shipping costs, and all that paperwork that comes with importing stuff. It could be a huge retailer like Walmart or a small mom-and-pop shop. Doesn't matter.
So those goods aren't just floating around in limbo.
Nope, they've got a home waiting for them.
So China doesn't actually get taxed directly by the U.S. It's the American company that placed the order that has to cough up the tariff money once those goods reach U.S. soil.
That's it in a nutshell. Now, the way tariffs can really bite China, the way they can feel the pinch, is if those tariffs make their goods so expensive that American buyers start to back off. They might order less or start looking for other places to get those products.
Right.
And that's when Chinese exporters really start to sweat.
And when we talk about a tariff being, say, 10% or 25%, is that percentage calculated based on what the American company paid for those goods up front? Or is it based on the final price tag that we see when we're shopping in the store?
It's based on the import price, the price the American company originally paid to the foreign seller for the goods.
Oh.
It's also sometimes called the customs value or the declared value.
Got it.
So let's say a company is importing those backpacks we talked about, and they pay $10 each for them.
Okay.
The tariff is calculated on that $10 price tag, not the $30 that they might end up selling them for in their stores.
Right. That makes sense. And just to be absolutely sure, when that tariff money is paid, it goes straight into the U.S. government's coffers, right?
100% correct. The U.S. government collects every penny of that tariff revenue.
China doesn't see a dime of it.
Not a dime. It becomes part of the federal government's income, just like income taxes or any other taxes they collect.
So, if the U.S. government is raking in all this extra dough from tariffs, why does it even matter if the import prices are higher to begin with? Wouldn't that tariff revenue kind of, balance things out, offset any negative effects from those higher import costs for businesses and consumers?
That's a really sharp question. While the U.S. government does get to pocket that tariff money, the economy as a whole can still suffer if the cost of imported goods gets too high. I mean, think about it. When those import costs go up, whether because of tariffs or other reasons, American businesses might see their profits shrink. Consumers might have to pay more for everyday stuff, which can fuel inflation. And domestic production, well, it might not always be able to step up and fill the gap right away, or it might be way more expensive to produce those things here. So even though the government gets that sweet tariff revenue, It often comes at a cost, you know? It can create these broader economic headaches like higher prices and slower growth. It's this delicate balancing act.
Let's try to make this more concrete. Let's imagine an American company wants to import 1,000 TVs from China, and each TV costs them $300. That puts the total import cost at $300,000.
Okay.
Now, if there are no tariffs, that $300,000, that's their baseline cost, right?
Right.
But let's say a 10% tariff is slapped on. What happens to their bottom line?
Well, a 10% tariff on $300,000 worth of TVs would mean that importer has to shell out an extra $30,000 to U.S. Customs. That bumps their total cost up to $330,000.
And now that importer's got to figure out how to deal with that extra $30,000. They might decide to raise the price of those TVs, hoping people will still buy them.
Right.
They could try to haggle with their Chinese supplier to get a lower price, but that might not always work out.
Sure.
They could bite the bullet and absorb the cost themselves, which would mean less profit for them. Or, like we've talked about, they could start shopping around for other suppliers in countries where there are no tariffs in place.
Exactly. Those are the typical moves we see companies making.
Makes sense.
So looking at all this data, all this historical info, and understanding how tariffs really work, what do you think will happen if we get hit with a big wave of new tariffs, like some folks are predicting?
That's a tough one.
Based on what we learned from those China tariffs, those steel and aluminum tariffs, those price increases, those shifts in supply chains, what seems like the most likely outcome to you?
Well, if we go by what we've seen before, I think it's pretty safe to say that we, the consumers, are going to end up paying more for stuff. We saw that happen with those tariffs on everyday things like clothes and shoes, and that tends to hit lower-income families the hardest.
Yeah, that seems to be a recurring theme, unfortunately.
And remember all the market jitters we saw whenever there was a big tariff announcement?
Oh, yeah.
The stock market would take a dive.
Investors hate uncertainty.
Exactly. And let's be real, there's almost no way we're not going to see other countries hitting back with their own tariffs. I mean, that's exactly what China and the EU did when the U.S. put tariffs on them.
Yep, history repeats itself.
They retaliated by putting tariffs on American exports, and that hurt our businesses, especially in agriculture and technology. Tariffs don't exist in a vacuum. They always trigger reactions.
They do. They set off this whole cascade of trade restrictions. And there's another big worry, and it's about the impact on the overall health of our economy.
Oh, right.
A lot of experts are saying that if we go down this road of widespread tariffs, it could actually shrink the U.S. economy, the GDP could go down. Yeah, and we could see job losses across the board. And I know tariffs are often touted as a bargaining chip to get better trade deals.
Right.
But they can also seriously damage relationships between countries, make it much harder to cooperate on international trade.
It's like playing with fire.
Exactly. And speaking of playing with fire, you mentioned something really interesting earlier. You said that using tariffs is kind of like playing Russian roulette.
Oh, yeah.
I thought that was a very powerful analogy. Could you unpack that a bit for us? What did you mean by that?
Well, it just seems to me that the only way these tariffs really hurt the exporting country, the country we're targeting, is if we, the U.S., either stop buying their stuff altogether, like just cut them off completely, or if they're forced to slash their prices to keep us as customers.
Right.
But if we can't easily find other places to get those same goods, or if it would cost us a fortune to make them here, then that tariff basically just turns into a tax that we end up paying. American businesses and ultimately us, the consumers, it feels like we're taking a gamble, a big risk, and we don't even have full control over whether it pays off. That's what I meant by Russian roulette.
That's a really astute observation. And you're right. If the U.S. doesn't have good alternatives for certain goods, especially those really crucial ones like rare earth minerals or those super specialized electronic components that go into everything these days.
Right.
Well, slapping a tariff on them might not actually punish the exporting country at all. It might just drive up costs for us.
Right.
And finding new suppliers or ramping up production here, that's not a quick fix. That takes time, serious investment. And for some of those essential things, there might not be any alternatives in the near future, period.
So it's like we're shooting ourselves in the foot, hoping it'll somehow scare them into changing their ways.
Exactly.
But if they know we're stuck,
that
we need their stuff, why would they budge?
That's the Russian roulette part, the gamble.
Yeah.
Tariffs only really work as leverage if the buyer, us, has other options, good options that are readily available. Otherwise, and one of your sources put this really well, we're just taxing ourselves while pretending we're punishing them.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
So to sum up our deep dive into this whole tariff business, it looks like the big takeaways are this. The tariffs, they're mostly paid by American companies, and that often means higher prices for all of us shoppers.
Yeah.
And while the idea might be to bring back jobs to the U.S., history shows us that there's no guarantee that'll happen.
Right.
And it might even lead to job losses in other parts of the economy.
Absolutely.
And whether those tariffs actually work, whether they do what they're supposed to, well, that really hinges on whether we can find other sources for those goods around the world and how willing our trading partners are to either swallow those extra costs or fight back with their own tariffs. It's complicated stuff.
You said it. The world economy is so interconnected.
That's
It's like
right.
this giant web, tug on one strand and the whole thing can shake. And trade policies, they can have these really intricate, far-reaching consequences. It's not always easy to predict what'll happen.
It's like a butterfly effect, right?
Exactly.
So let's end on that Russian roulette analogy, that gamble. Here's something for everyone listening to think about. Take a minute and consider which industries, which of those critical supply chains are going to leave the U.S. the most exposed if these tariff wars really heat up.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Which essential goods, which materials might American consumers and businesses find themselves struggling to get if those supply lines get disrupted? I mean, what if there just aren't any good alternatives out there? That's something worth pondering. It goes way deeper than just the headlines about tariffs, It's about thinking strategically long term.